The boy watched from under the canvas flap as the wagon boss threw something small and dark into the snow. It landed in the wheel rut and lay there. The woman climbed down from the tailboard without being asked twice. Her coat was patched at both elbows. She held her arms close to her body the way a person holds something broken. The ox teams pulled forward, and the harness bells thinned into the white distance, and the boy kept watching because no one had told him he could stop. The thing in the rut was a hand auger. She picked it up. She did not follow the wagons. December 29, 1887. The wagons were already a quarter-mile ahead when Ragna Brecka stopped watching them. The ox teams moved slow, but they moved, and the distance between her and the last tailboard grew at the pace of a thing that would not be argued with. Snow drove sideways across the Loop River flat in fine, dry sheets that hissed against the frozen grass. The sky was the color of a tin plate left too long near a fire. She had 23 years behind her and $3.80 in a cloth purse knotted inside her coat. One wool blanket, one tin cup, a knife with a crack running through the handle where the rivet had worked loose somewhere east of Grand Island. 2 letters she could not use because the man who controlled the wagon string had taken the third, the one with the name and address of the Norwegian family near Genoa who were supposed to receive her, and her father's hand auger, which Merritt Vale had thrown into the snow the way a person throws a dog a scrap to stop its begging. The auger lay in the track rut where it had landed. Ragna picked it up. The wooden handle was cold enough to burn, and she tucked it under her arm against her ribs where the wool coat was thickest. The steel bit caught a sliver of gray light. She had paid $21 for passage from Omaha. That money was gone. She had no team, no gun, no stove, no legal standing in the wagon party, and a cough that had started as a dry scratch somewhere near Columbus and now sat deep enough in her chest that drawing a full breath made her ribs ache. She could sew. She could keep a dairy ledger. She could read weather through the crust of old snow and the behavior of animals, the way her father had taught her in Telemark before the tenancy collapsed and her mother died, and the parish had nothing left to offer except a letter of reference and a steerage ticket. None of that mattered on a river flat in central Nebraska, with the temperature dropping and no shelter visible in any direction. The wagons shrank. The sound of harness bells thinned to nothing, and then there was only the wind and the hiss of snow against dead grass and her own breathing. Merritt Vale had called it a business decision. She had consumed food she could not repay. She had slowed the train because her cough made her useless for walking pace, and she rode when others walked. She had claimed relatives in Columbus, but Columbus was behind them, and no relatives had appeared. Merritt said her letter of introduction to the Genoa family was evidence of debt, not passage, and he kept it along with her trunk, the one holding her spare dress, her sewing needles, her mother's Bible, and the small wooden box of dried herbs her aunt had pressed into her hands at the dock in Christiania. He kept everything except the auger. The auger was not worth selling. Ragna stood in the wagon track with the wind flattening her skirt against her legs and the snow beginning to fill the ruts. 5 miles to the nearest occupied soddy, Asa Whitcomb had said. 12 miles to the nearest town. 4 hours of usable daylight left, maybe less with the cloud cover thickening from the northwest, and the wind was rising. Asa Whitcomb was the last person who had spoken to her before the wagons pulled away. He was 59, a former Army teamster who had hauled freight and claims across enough Nebraska winters to have opinions that sounded like verdicts. He was not cruel. He was tired in the way men get tired when they have seen too many people arrive on the plains without understanding what the plains demanded. He had stood beside the rear wagon while Merritt argued with the other men about the delay, and he had looked at Ragna the way a man looks at a calf born too late in the season, not with malice, but with the particular sadness of someone who already knows the arithmetic. A person alone on this river flat needs 4 walls, 6 cords of seasoned wood, a stove that drafts clean, and a neighbor close enough to hear a rifle shot, Asa said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You have none of those things. Not one. Ragna had said nothing. There was nothing to say that would change the math. Nearest occupied place is the Roach Soddy, 5 miles south and east along the creek bluff, Asa continued. Lavina Roach is a hard woman, but she has fed strays before. If you walk now and do not stop, you might reach it before full dark. Might, he paused. If the wind holds where it is, if it shifts north, you will not make 2 miles. He had looked at her hands. Her mittens were wool, felted, and stiff, with hardtack crumbs caught in the left palm from the last meal she had been allowed to eat with the group. Her boots were sound, but not tall enough for drifted snow. Her coat was heavy, but patched at both elbows where the wool had worn through. "I'm sorry about this," Asa said. And he had meant it. That was the worst part. That he meant it, and it changed nothing. He climbed back onto the wagon seat, and the train moved on, and Ragna Breka was alone on the Loop River flat with a hand auger, a blanket, a cracked knife, a tin cup, $3.80, and approximately 4 hours before the cold finished what Merritt Vale had started. She did not cry. Crying cost warmth. She wrapped the blanket over her coat, tucked the cup into her waistband, and faced south toward the creek bluff Asa had described. 5 miles. She could walk a mile in 20 minutes on flat ground in good weather. This was not flat ground, and this was not good weather. The snow was ankle deep in the open and knee deep where it had drifted against the dead grass clumps. Every step required lifting her boot clear before planting the next one. A mile would take 40 minutes. 5 miles would take more than 3 hours, and she did not have 3 hours of light. She walked anyway. The dog appeared after the first quarter mile. It came from beneath a clump of chokecherry scrub near the old wagon track, low to the ground, ribs visible beneath a coat of yellow-brown fur matted with burrs. It had a torn strip of wagon canvas knotted around its neck, someone's idea of a collar or a bandage, or both. The strip was stiff with frozen mud. Ragna recognized it. The dog had been under the wagons for at least a week, eating scraps that fell between the wheels, sleeping beneath whichever wagon sat lowest to the ground. Nobody owned it. Nobody fed it on purpose. It had followed the train the way stray dogs follow anything that moves and occasionally drops food. It stopped 10 feet from her and sat in the snow. Its ears were flat. Its tail moved once. Not a wag, but a question. Ragna pulled the last crumb of hardtack from her mitten and held it out. The dog took it from her fingers with a gentleness that surprised her. Its teeth were yellow, and its breath was warm against her knuckles. "You are also not wanted," Ragna said. The dog, she would call it Tippet later, for the torn canvas strip, stood and trotted toward the willow thickets along the creek. It stopped after 20 paces and looked back at her. It whined. Ragna looked south, toward the roach soddy she could not see and might not reach. Then she looked at the dog, standing in the willows with its ears forward and its body angled toward something she could not identify. She followed the dog. It was not a decision she could have defended to Asa Whitcomb or anyone else who understood survival on the plains. The rational choice was the soddy. The soddy had walls and a stove, and a woman who had fed strays before. The willows had nothing, or so the rational mind would calculate. But Ragna's father had told her once, in the root cellar beneath their tenant house in Telemark, that animals do not walk toward death when they can smell warmth. He had said it about the barn cat that always found the hay pile closest to the stone wall that held the day's heat longest. It was not a lesson she had filed away as survival knowledge. It was a memory of her father's hand on a damp stone wall, his voice low and certain, the smell of turnips and lantern soot in the dark. She followed the dog into the willows. The brush was dense enough to break the wind. That alone was something. The temperature on the open flat had been dropping since mid-afternoon. She guessed 12 degrees, maybe 10, and falling. In the willows, with the scrub blocking the worst of the horizontal snow, it felt 5 degrees warmer. Not warm, less deadly. Tippet pushed through a tangle of dead willow branches and disappeared into what looked like a snowbank against a low rise. Ragna heard it scrabbling, then silence, then a short bark that echoed strangely. Not the flat sound a bark makes in open air, but something rounder, something contained. She got on her hands and knees. The snow was packed hard against the rise, but there was a gap where Tippet had pushed through, a dark opening no wider than her shoulders, angling downward. Cold air came from it, but not wind. The air inside was still. Ragna pushed her blanket through first, then the auger, then herself. The passage was perhaps 8 feet long, sloping down at an angle steep enough that she slid the last 3 feet on her stomach and landed on packed earth in total darkness. The darkness was not empty. It hummed. Not a mechanical hum. Not an animal. The low, constant tone of wind passing over a structure that absorbed it rather than transmitted it. The sound a root cellar makes when a storm passes overhead, the sound of earth holding. She could not see. She could feel. The floor beneath her palms was hard-packed earth, smooth, slightly concave. The air was cold but not cutting, nothing like the knife-edge wind on the flat above. She could smell ash, old ash, months old, maybe years, mouse droppings, damp earth, and something else faintly, the ghost of smoke, worked into the walls and floor by years of fires. Tippet was beside her, panting. Its body was warm against her leg. Ragna waited for her eyes to adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged. A faint grayness above her, a small opening in what she now understood was a roof, crusted with snow and ice, but not completely sealed. Through that opening, the last gray light of the December sky filtered down in a column no wider than a dinner plate. She could see the outline of the space. It was circular, large, much larger than any root cellar she had known. 4 thick posts stood in a rough square near the center, supporting a framework of beams and rafters that angled upward to the roof. The walls curved inward from floor to ceiling, packed earth over a structure she could feel but not fully see. Layers of something beneath the dirt. Grass, willow branches. A construction method she did not recognize. In the center of the floor, directly beneath the smoke hole, was a shallow pit filled with old ash and charred wood fragments. A fire pit. Not a stove box, not a hearth built of stone, but a pit scooped from the earth floor and lined with clay that had cracked and darkened over years of use. Ragna Brecka was inside an earth lodge. She did not know the word for it. She did not know that Pawnee families had built structures like this one along the Loop River and its tributaries for generations. Circular, timber-framed, insulated with layers of willow, grass, and earth, designed to hold warmth in winter and shed rain in spring. She did not know that the lodge she had fallen into was likely decades old, abandoned when the Pawnee were removed from Nebraska, weathered and silted, and slowly swallowed by the prairie, but not destroyed. The center posts were cottonwood, thick as a man's thigh, and the outer inch of each was punky with rot. But the heartwood was hard. The roof earth was 2 feet thick in places. The entrance passage she had crawled through was the original design, a protected tunnel that broke the wind and forced cold air to rise over a lip before entering the main chamber. She did not know any of this. What she knew was that the wind had stopped. What she knew was that when she pressed her palm to the packed wall, the way her father had pressed his palm to the root cellar stone, the earth was cold, but not killing cold. What she knew was that her breath, visible in the faint light from the smoke hole, did not stream sideways the way it had on the flat. It rose, straight up, into still air. The lodge was not warm. It was perhaps 35 degrees inside, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough that her wet mittens would stiffen overnight, cold enough that sleeping without fire would mean a slow, numb slide toward hypothermia. But it was 35 degrees in a space where the wind could not reach her, and outside it was 10 degrees and dropping with a north wind that would push the effective temperature below 0 by midnight. The difference between 35 degrees with no wind and 10 degrees with wind was the difference between a hard night and a dead one. Ragna sat on the packed earth floor with her back against one of the center posts and her blanket pulled around her shoulders and the dog pressed against her hip, and she did not sleep, and she did not cry, and she thought about fuel. The lodge had wood, not much. Against the far wall, half hidden by a collapse of earth and old willow matting, she could make out a stack of branches and split pieces, cottonwood and willow, dry enough that when she broke a twig it snapped clean. Half a cord, maybe, if she was generous with the estimate. Old wood, stacked by someone who had not returned for it. Enough for small fires over perhaps 2 weeks if she burned carefully. Enough for large fires over 4 days if she panicked. She had no food worth counting. The hardtack was gone. She had given the last piece to the dog. 2 onions in her coat pocket, overlooked during the expulsion because Merritt had not thought to search her person. Frozen rose hips grew on bushes outside, if she could find them under snow. Snow melt for water, if she could heat it without choking on smoke. The survival math was simple and brutal. Without this lodge, she would have died tonight on the open flat, or, if she was lucky, reached the roach soddy half-frozen and dependent on a stranger's mercy. Inside the lodge, she had shelter from wind and a chance at fire. But shelter without fuel was a slower death. Shelter without food was a slower death. Shelter without knowledge of how this structure worked, how to ventilate it, how to keep the roof from collapsing, how to manage moisture and smoke and drainage, was a gamble on ignorance. The lodge was not salvation. It was a question. Could she learn fast enough to make it answer? Outside, the wind picked up. Snow hissed across the crusted smoke hole. Tippet pressed closer, and Ragna felt the dog's heartbeat against her thigh, fast and steady and alive. She broke 3 twigs from the old woodpile and arranged them in the ash pit. She struck her knife against a piece of flint she carried in her coat lining, a habit from Telemark, where fire-making was not a skill but a reflex. The sparks caught on a twist of dry grass she pulled from the exposed matting near the wall. A small flame, then a slightly larger one. The smoke rose toward the crusted hole, hit the ice seal, and spilled back into the chamber in a brown curl that made her cough until her ribs ached. She could not breathe, and she could not stop the fire, because without the fire, she could not survive the night. She grabbed the willow pole she had tripped over near the entrance and shoved it upward through the smoke hole, punching through the ice crust. A fist-sized gap opened. Cold air rushed down. Smoke rushed up. The draft reversed, and the brown curl turned blue-gray and climbed in a thin column toward the stars she could not see. She fed the fire 1 twig at a time. The flames stayed small. The smoke stayed blue. The lodge began slowly to hold the warmth the way her father's root cellar had held the warmth, not by making heat, but by refusing to give it away. Ragna hung her wet mitten on a splinter of wood near the fire pit and watched it. On the open flat, a wet mitten would freeze solid in 10 minutes. Here, after 20 minutes, the mitten was stiff but not rigid. The wool was drying, not freezing. The air inside the lodge was doing something the open air could not do. It was holding still long enough for warmth to accumulate. She pressed her palm to the wall again, still cold. But when she moved her hand to the packed floor near the fire, where the earth had been absorbing heat from fires built in this same pit by people she would never meet, the floor was not cold. It was cool. There was a difference. Cold takes. Cool holds. Her father's voice came back to her in the dark. Earth does not warm quickly, but it does not surrender warmth quickly either. She did not understand yet what she had found. She understood only that she was not dead, and that the dog had known something she had not, and that the walls around her had been built by hands that understood this country in ways the settlers' frame houses and thin-walled soddies did not. Morning came gray and silent. The fire had burned down to a coal the size of her fist. The lodge was 40 degrees. Outside, when she crawled through the entrance passage and stood blinking in the flat white light, the thermometer nailed to the nearest fence post. She found it 100 yards east, marking an abandoned claim. Read 6 degrees. The wind had died to a murmur, but the cold was deep and settled, the kind that makes wood crack and iron burn bare skin. She went back inside. The first full day was inventory. She counted the woodpile, half a cord, as she had guessed, maybe slightly less. She tested roof beams with the auger handle, tapping and listening. 2 beams rang solid. One gave a dull thud. The outer wood was soft, rotted through. She did not know if 1 weak beam meant the roof could fail, but she knew weak things broke under weight, and the weight above her was 2 feet of frozen earth. She cleared the smoke hole wider using the willow pole, knocking ice and packed snow until the opening was the width of a dinner plate. Smoke moved freely now, but wind crossing the opening drove it back at unpredictable intervals. The lodge could breathe, but only when the wind allowed it. She needed to learn the draft. She tested the entrance passage. It was partly collapsed. Earth had slumped from the right wall, narrowing the tunnel to a crawl. But the design was clear. The passage entered from the south, curved slightly, and opened into the main chamber below the floor level. Wind could not blow straight through. It had to rise over a lip. That lip was the difference between a drafty hole and a sheltered room. She found the drainage cut, a shallow groove in the floor running from the center toward the entrance, barely visible under packed ash and dirt. When she scraped it clean with the broken blade of a hoe she found near the woodpile, she could see the engineering. The floor sloped slightly, almost imperceptibly, from the rear wall toward the entry. Water would flow out, not pool. Someone had planned this. Someone had built a house that managed water, smoke, wind, and heat with nothing but earth, wood, grass, and understanding. Ragna sat in the gray light filtering through the smoke hole and looked at the walls that curved around her. She was alive because people she had never met, people whose names she did not know, people whose descendants had been removed from this land, had built something that worked. She owed them her next breath. She did not yet know how to repay it, but she knew that burning the lodge beams for firewood, or tearing out the willow matting for bedding, or treating this place as scavenging material would be a kind of theft she could not stomach. She would use what the lodge offered. She would not consume it. The sound of boots crunching through snow crust reached her from outside. Tippett's ears went flat, and a low growl started in the dog's chest. Lavina Roach appeared at the entrance passage, bent double, breathing hard. She was 36, raw-boned, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood as the fence posts she repaired herself. She had followed dog prints across the creek bluff while searching for a milk cow that had broken its hobble in the night. She did not expect to find a woman living underground. Lavina stood in the center of the lodge and looked up at the smoke hole, then down at the fire pit, then at the walls, then at Ragna. Her face moved through surprise, calculation, and something that looked like the specific displeasure of a person who has just discovered a problem she did not ask for. "How long have you been in here?" Lavina asked. "One night," Ragna said. "Alone?" "With the dog." Lavina touched the nearest wall. She pulled her hand back and looked at her fingers as if expecting dirt or insects or something worse. "This is a Pawnee house," she said. "An old one. I heard there were some along the river, but I never saw one standing." "It is standing," Ragna said. "Barely." Lavina looked up at the roof beams. "Earth over your head is weight. Any fool with a soddy knows that. Wet earth is worse, and smoke under it. Smoke under packed earth is a death you do not see coming. It puts you to sleep, and then it keeps you asleep." She looked at the fire pit. "You have been burning with that hole half sealed?" "I opened it." "Not enough." Lavina walked the perimeter, pressing her hand to the wall every few feet, the way a person tests ice on a pond. "The matting is exposed here and here. Earth washes through when the grass rots away. Wet seasons, this whole wall section could slump." She kicked the base of the weakest post. "This one is soft." "I know," Ragna said. "I tested it." "You tested it?" Lavina said this flatly, without inflection, the way a person repeats something they are not sure they believe. "With what?" Ragna held up the auger. Lavina stared at the auger, then at Ragna, then at the lodge. "A person in a hole with a hand drill and a dog. This is what the Lord has given me to find instead of my cow." But she did not leave. She stood in the center of the lodge and she looked, and what she saw, Ragna could tell, was not just a desperate woman in a ruin. She saw a fire that burned clean. She saw a smoke hole that had been cleared by hand. She saw a floor that had been scraped along the drainage line. She saw a woodpile that had not been ransacked but restacked on poles to keep it off the damp ground. "You did all this since last night?" Lavina asked. "Since this morning." Lavina said nothing for a long time. Then she pulled a cloth sack from inside her coat. Cornmeal, maybe a dipper's worth. She set it on the sleeping bench near the rear wall. I still think this roof may bury you, Lavina said, but if you are going to be buried, I will not have it be hungry. She left through the entrance passage without looking back. At the opening, she paused and said over her shoulder, "Some places belong to stories older than us. I would not stay too long." Then she was gone, and Ragna was alone again with the cornmeal and the dog and the question she could not yet answer. Was the lodge a refuge she could trust, or a trap she did not understand well enough to escape? The method was not build a fire. The method was stop the room from giving heat away. Ragna did not arrive at this understanding in a single moment of inspiration. It built across the first 3 days the way her father's lessons had built in the Telemark root cellar, through observation, through testing, through the slow accumulation of evidence that added up to a principle she could name but had not yet proven. Day 1, she noticed. A wet mitten hung near the fire stiffened less than it should. The air was holding warmth. Day 2, she tested. She pressed her palm to the packed wall in 3 places, near the entrance, at the midpoint, and at the rear. The entrance was coldest. The rear was warmest. The earth was not uniform. It absorbed heat from the fire at different rates, depending on thickness, moisture, and proximity. Day 3, she measured. She placed her tin cup full of snowmelt near the entrance, and another cup near the rear wall. By morning, the entrance cup had a skin of ice. The rear cup did not. The difference in temperature between the 2 points was real and consistent. The rear of the lodge, farthest from the entrance draft and closest to the thickest earth, held heat the way a stone holds the sun's warmth after sunset, slowly releasing what it had absorbed. This was her father's root cellar principle scaled to a living space. Earth does not warm quickly, but once it absorbs heat, it returns that heat slowly, steadily, even after the fire dies. A sod house did this too, crudely, but a sod house was a box, open to drafts at every seam, and the walls were 2 feet thick at best. This lodge was circular, which meant no corners where cold air pooled. The walls were packed earth over layered insulation. The entrance tunnel broke the wind. The smoke hole was centered over the fire pit. Every element served the same purpose: hold warmth in, keep wind out, manage smoke up. The insight was not the fire. The insight was the room itself. The room was the technology. The fire was just the source. The lodge was the system that kept the source's output from bleeding away into the frozen sky. But knowing the principle and executing it were separated by a gap that could kill her. The smoke hole needed a windscreen, or the draft reversed every time the wind shifted. The weak post needed shoring, or the roof sagged further with every freeze-thaw cycle. The exposed willow matting needed patching, or moisture would seep through and rot the structure from inside. The entrance passage needed narrowing, or crosswind would cut the temperature by 10 degrees in minutes. She needed to reactivate the lodge. Not repair it. That implied she could restore it to what it had been. She needed to stabilize it enough to survive in it. Shore the weak points, patch the gaps, manage the smoke, stock fuel in dry niches where it would not absorb moisture from the walls. Cook with coals, not flames, because a roaring fire consumed fuel at 4 times the rate and cracked the frozen earth of the roof. She could do some of this with the tools she had: the auger, the knife, the broken hoe blade, her hands. She could cut sod blocks from the prairie with the hoe and stack them in the entrance passage to narrow the gap. She could weave dead grass into mats and press them against the exposed wall sections. She could split willow branches and wedge them under the weak beam as crude shoring, but she could not do all of it. Not alone. Not fast enough. Not without knowledge she did not have about how the structure worked under the stress of a real plains winter, the kind where the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour and the wind drove snow through gaps she could not see. She made the calculation. If she spent her strength repairing the lodge and it failed, the roof collapsed, the smoke poisoned her, the entrance sealed under a drift, she would die inside it. If she abandoned the lodge and walked to town, 12 miles across open ground. In winter, she would likely freeze before she made it. If she went to Lavina's soddy, she would be alive but dependent, a charity case in a community that had already decided she was not worth feeding. She chose the lodge. She chose it not because it was safe, but because it was the only option that depended on her own effort rather than someone else's mercy. And because the lodge, whatever she did not yet understand about it, had been built by people who understood this country, and that understanding was still in the walls. The risk was clear, the timeline was unclear, and the weather was not waiting for her to learn. News traveled the way it always traveled in scattered settlements, slowly, inaccurately, and with embellishment at every telling. By the 3rd day of January, 1888, the story had reached the general store at the crossroads 12 miles east. The Brecka girl, the one Merritt Vale had put off the wagon train, was alive, living underground, in a hole near the river. Like a badger, said the storekeeper's wife, who had not seen Ragna but had heard from Lavina's neighbor, who had heard from Lavina, who had said only that the woman was stubborn and underground. The community's response was not uniform, but it sorted into patterns Ragna could have predicted if she had been listening. Some settlers saw her survival as proof of desperation so extreme it was embarrassing, a woman who had lost everything and now lived in dirt because she had no other choice. Some saw opportunity. An unmarried woman alone was either a problem to be managed or a resource to be absorbed. A few saw danger. The lodge was Pawnee, and anything Pawnee was either cursed, contested, or both. The prevailing wisdom was plain. Survival on the plains required a claim, a stove, a man's team, and visible walls. A homestead had 4 corners, a door, and a chimney. It sat on ground that had been filed at the land office. It could be defended, improved, sold, and passed to children. A hidden lodge in a riverbank violated all of that. It was too old, too native, too invisible, too much like something an animal would do, not a person building a life. Merritt Vale heard the news on January 5th. He had continued west with the wagon train, delivered freight to a rancher near the Forks, and turned back toward the settlements for winter quartering. He had not expected Ragna to survive. Her death, if it had happened, would have been one of the small tragedies the plains produced every winter, regrettable, unremarkable, and unlikely to generate questions that reached anyone with authority to investigate. Her survival changed his calculation. He arrived at the lodge entrance on January 6th with 2 men Ragna did not recognize, hired hands or debtors. She could not tell which. The 3 of them stood on the packed snow above the entrance passage, and Merritt looked down at the dark gap the way a man looks at a hole he wishes he had filled. "Ragna Brecka," Merritt said. He did not crouch. He spoke downward, into the tunnel, where Ragna stood with the broken hoe in one hand and Tippet growling at her feet. "I am here," she said. "So I see." Merritt's voice was level, pleasant, the voice of a man who had practiced delivering bad news as though it were weather. "You crawled into an Indian hole and now call it Providence. That does not make it yours." "I do not call it mine," Ragna said. "I call it warm." "Warm." Merritt repeated the word as though tasting it for spoilage. "You are squatting on land that is not claimed, in a structure that is not a dwelling under any statute this territory recognizes. If I were to report this to the county clerk, he would tell you the same thing I'm telling you. You have no standing here." Ragna said nothing. She held the hoe handle across the entrance, not as a weapon, but as a barrier. The passage was narrow enough that one person could block it. Merritt looked past her into the dim interior. She knew what he was seeing: the glow of coals in the fire pit, the stacked wood against the far wall, the dry sleeping bench, the faint warmth that rose from the entrance like breath. He was calculating. She could see it in his eyes, the same look he had worn when he took her trunk, the look of a man measuring what something was worth. "The timber in there could be salvaged," Merritt said. "Old cottonwood posts, dry as bone, worth something to the right buyer." "The timber is holding up the roof," Ragna said. "If you take it, the roof falls." "That would be your problem, not mine." "It would be your problem if I tell Asa Whitcomb you came here to strip a shelter with a woman inside it." The name landed. Asa Whitcomb was not powerful, but he was known, and known men have a weight that exceeds their authority. Merritt's jaw tightened. Whitcomb is a teamster with opinions, Merritt said. He does not decide who owns what in this territory. He decides who people trust, Ragna said, and he knows I am alive. Merritt stood for a long moment. The two men behind him shifted their weight. One of them looked at the other. Neither spoke. Merritt turned and walked back toward the horses. At the edge of the willows, he stopped and said, without turning around, "A hole is a hole. Winter does not care what you call it." He left, but he had seen the inside. He had seen the dry wood, the coal bed, the warmth, and Ragna understood, with the certainty of a woman who had watched a man calculate the value of her trunk while she stood in the snow, that Merritt Vale was not finished. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were trying to build? The next morning, Ragna cut her first sod blocks. The prairie outside the lodge was frozen, but not uniformly, where the south-facing slope caught what little sun the January sky offered. The top 2 inches of soil thawed enough by midday to work. She used the hoe blade to cut strips roughly 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, and about 3 feet long, the same dimensions she had seen in the walls of every soddy between Omaha and the Loup River. The blocks were heavy. Each one weighed close to 50 pounds, and carrying them from the cutting site to the entrance passage, a distance of perhaps 80 feet, required a grip that split her already cracked hands and a posture that drove pain into the small of her back like a nail. She stacked the first course inside the entrance passage, narrowing the tunnel from both sides. The original passage had been wide enough for a person to walk through slightly hunched. Ragna narrowed it to a crawl, wide enough for her body and the dog, narrow enough that the wind could not find a straight path through. The sod blocks fit against the existing earth walls with the rough interlocking grip of material made for this purpose. She packed grass into the seams. By the end of the first day of construction, she had laid 12 blocks. The entrance draft dropped enough that she could feel the difference inside the lodge. The air near the fire pit no longer swirled with cross currents, but 12 blocks was nothing. She needed 40 or more to complete the entrance narrowing, patch 2 wall sections where the old matting had failed, and build a low windscreen above the smoke hole. 40 blocks meant 40 trips. 40 trips meant 2 days of cutting, hauling, and stacking in conditions that stole energy faster than cornmeal could replace it. She ate the first onion that evening, raw, sliced with her cracked knife and laid on a flat stone near the coals until the edges softened. She gave Tippett the papery skin and the root end. The dog ate both. Day 2, January 8th. She woke at first light, or what passed for first light inside the lodge, a gray brightening of the smoke hole that meant the sun was somewhere above the cloud cover. Temperature inside, she guessed 38 degrees based on the frost pattern on her tin cup. Better than the first night. The sod blocks in the entrance were already making a difference. She cut 15 blocks, hauled them, stacked them. Her hands bled through the mitten wool, and she wrapped them with strips torn from the hem of her underskirt. The blood froze in the fabric and made the wrapping stiff, but the pressure stopped the worst of the cracking. The weak roof beam worried her. She could hear it in the mornings, a faint creak when the temperature shifted and the frozen earth above expanded or contracted. She needed to shore it, but shoring required a forked prop strong enough to bear the weight of 2 feet of packed earth, and that meant cutting a cottonwood limb thick enough to hold, and she had no axe. She had the auger, her father's auger, with its steel bit and its worn wooden handle. It was a tool for boring holes, not felling trees, but Ragna had watched her father bore a circle of holes around a knot in a barn beam and then knock the weakened section free with a mallet. If she could bore enough holes in a standing dead cottonwood, a ring of holes at the base, the trunk might crack under its own weight when the wind pushed it. It would take hours. It would take strength she was not sure she had. And if the wind did not cooperate, if the cottonwood held, she would have wasted a day she could not afford. She found the tree on January 9th, a dead cottonwood 30 paces from the lodge entrance, stripped of bark, gray as old bone, with a trunk the diameter of a fence post. Not large, not enough for a permanent prop, but enough maybe for a temporary shore until she found something better. She bored 12 holes around the base. Each hole took 15 minutes. Her arms shook. Her cough came back, sharp and wet, and she had to stop twice to lean against the trunk and breathe until the spasm passed. Tippett sat in the snow and watched her with the patience of an animal that does not understand effort but recognizes it. By mid-afternoon, the wind shifted northwest. The cottonwood creaked. Ragna stepped back. The trunk cracked along the line of boreholes, tilted, and fell with a sound like a bone-breaking A, short, sharp, final. She dragged it to the lodge, cut the fork top with the hoe blade and knife, working the frozen wood in a V-shaped notch until the fork separated, wedged the base against the lodge floor and the fork under the weakest rafter. The beam stopped creaking. It was not enough. One prop under one beam was not a repair. It was a bandage on a wound she could not see the full extent of. But the creak stopped, and the roof held, and January 9th became January 10th, and she was still alive. The temperature dropped on January 10th. She could feel it in the quality of the air, drier, thinner, the kind of cold that made the inside of her nose sting when she inhaled. The smoke hole iced over twice before noon. She cleared it both times with the willow pole, but each time the ice reformed faster. She was running out of knowledge. She could cut sod. She could stack it. She could bore holes and fell small trees and shore beams and manage a coal fire. But the lodge had been designed by people who understood things she did not. How to build a windscreen that protected the smoke hole without sealing it. How to read the draft so that smoke climbed instead of rolled. How to manage moisture so that the earth walls did not absorb the warmth she was trying to keep. She was operating a machine she could not fully read, and the machine's tolerances were narrowing as the temperature fell. She needed someone who knew. She needed someone who understood what this lodge was and how it worked, and what it needed to survive a real storm. Not the ordinary cold of early January, but the killing cold that came when the planes decided to stop pretending. She did not know that person existed. She did not know that person was already watching. But the lodge held, and the dog slept beside her, and the smoke rose blue in the darkness, and outside the wind built towards something Ragna could feel in her bones, but could not yet name. Chunk 2 continues. Josephine Baptiste came on the 11th day. Ragna did not see her approach. She was inside the lodge, scraping the drainage groove with the broken hoe blade, when Tippett's ears went flat and the growl started, low, steady, different from the growl the dog made for strangers. This was a sound of confusion. Something outside did not fit the patterns the dog had learned. Ragna crawled through the entrance passage and stood in the gray morning light. A woman stood 10 paces from the smoke hole, looking down at it with her arms folded across her chest. She was perhaps 50, perhaps older. Age sat on her face the way weather sits on sandstone, wearing some features sharp and smoothing others away. She wore a heavy wool coat belted with a braided sash, a fur-lined cap that covered her ears, and boots that were not settler boots. They were tall, fitted, stitched with a pattern Ragna did not recognize. Her skin was darker than any of the settlers Ragna had met, and her hands, visible where they gripped her elbows, were broad and scarred across the knuckles. She was looking at the smoke hole with an expression Ragna could not read. Not curiosity, not surprise, something closer to recognition, the face of a person seeing a thing they had known once and expected never to see again. "You patched the vent wrong," the woman said, without looking at Ragna. Her English was clear, slightly accented with something that was not Norwegian or German or any of the speech patterns Ragna had heard on the wagon train. "The screen should sit on the windward side, not over the top. You are choking the draw." Ragna said nothing. She did not know who this woman was, or how she knew about the vent. The woman turned and looked at her. Dark eyes, steady, the kind of gaze that took inventory without asking permission. "My name is Josephine Baptiste," she said. "My father was a French trader out of Bellevue. My mother was Pawnee. She was born in a house like the one you are sleeping in." She paused. "I have not seen one standing in 11 years. Ragna felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not relief, but the specific gravity of understanding that she was standing in front of the person who could answer every question the lodge had raised. I did not know how to fix the vent, Ragna said. I can see that. Josephine walked to the entrance passage and crouched. She looked inside for a long time. Then she straightened and said, You have not torn out the beams for firewood. You have not ripped the matting for bedding. You kept the hearth small. She looked at Ragna again. Why? Because the house is not mine to destroy, Ragna said. Josephine said nothing for what felt like a full minute. Wind moved through the willows. Tippet had stopped growling and sat between the two women with its ears forward, reading the silence. You are alive because people you never thanked knew how to build for this country, Josephine said. I will show you how to keep it working, not because you deserve it, because the house deserves it. She went inside. Ragna followed. The first thing Josephine taught was draft. She picked up a piece of charred wood from the ash pit and held it near the smoke hole. The smoke from its glowing tip rose in a thin line, then bent sharply to the left and curled downward. Josephine pointed at the curl. Brown and rolling, she said. That is your warning. When smoke rolls back, the air above the vent is pushing down harder than the warm air inside is pushing up. If you sleep through that, you do not wake up. She pulled the grass mat Ragna had stuffed over the windward side of the smoke hole and repositioned it, not on top, but angled against the prevailing wind like a shield. The effect was immediate. The smoke line straightened, turned blue-gray, and climbed in a column that did not waver. Blue and climbing, Josephine said. That means safe. Check it every time the wind changes. Every time. The second lesson was the posts. Josephine took the auger from Ragna and struck the handle against each of the 4 center posts in turn. 2 rang solid, a sharp, clean note that said the wood was dense and whole. 1 gave the dull thud Ragna already knew, the post she had shored with the cottonwood fork. The 4th gave a sound between the 2, a muffled tone that made Josephine frown. This one is not failed yet, Josephine said, pressing her thumb into the post's surface. But the outer wood is soft for 3 inches. If the roof takes heavy wet snow and the temperature drops, the weight could split it along the grain. She looked at the cottonwood prop under the weakest beam. You did this? Yes. It will hold for now, but you need a second prop here. She pointed to the 4th post. Before you need it, not after. They went out together and found a second dead cottonwood, thicker than the first, and Ragna bored the ring of holes while Josephine watched without offering to help. When the tree fell, Josephine showed her how to split the fork by driving the knife blade into the grain and twisting rather than hacking, a technique that preserved the fork's strength rather than splintering it. They wedged the second prop under the questionable beam. The roof stopped making sounds Ragna had not consciously registered, but had been hearing every night, faint ticks and groans as frozen earth shifted above her. The third lesson was water. Josephine crouched beside the drainage groove and ran her fingers along its length. This is the channel, she said. The floor slopes from the sleeping bench toward the entrance. Water follows the slope. If this channel is blocked, dirt, ash, ice, the water pools under the sleeping platform, and wet earth under a packed floor turns to mud. Mud does not hold heat. Mud does not support weight. Mud is how an earth house dies from below. Ragna had cleaned the groove, but not well enough. Josephine took the hoe blade and deepened it by an inch along the full length, then cleared a path through the entrance passage where the sod blocks had partially covered the drain line. Every 3 days, Josephine said. Clear it. Even when you think it is clear, ice builds where you cannot see it. The 4th lesson was the one that stayed. Josephine stood in the center of the lodge and pointed at the walls, the cache pits along the perimeter, and a shallow depression near the rear wall that Ragna had assumed was natural settling. Do not disturb the pits, Josephine said. One is collapsed and empty, that one near the entrance. The others may hold things that do not belong to you. Not food, not treasure, belongings. If you find a bundle, a bone, an object wrapped in hide, you leave it. You do not touch it. You do not move it. You do not look at it more than once. Ragna nodded. This is not your house, Josephine said. You are a guest in a place that remembers its builders. Treat it that way. The words carried a weight that Ragna felt in her throat. She understood that Josephine was not simply protecting old belongings. She was protecting the fact that this place had been a home before it was a ruin, and that the people who had built it had been removed, not departed. The lodge stood because it had been built well. It was empty because the builders had been made to leave. Ragna said, I will not forget who built this. Josephine looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Good. Now learn to keep coals, not flames. The fifth lesson, fire discipline, came that evening. Josephine sat beside the hearth and watched Ragna build the fire the way she had been building it. Small twigs, careful feeding, a modest blaze that gave light and some warmth. Josephine waited until the flames were steady, then reached into the pit and pulled half the burning wood out with her bare hands, scattering the pieces on the clay floor where they smoldered and died. Ragna stared. A fire that burns is a fire that eats, Josephine said. Flames consume fuel 4 times faster than coals. Flames crack frozen earth. Flames make light, which you do not need at night, and heat, which rises through the smoke hole and leaves. Coals sit low. Coals radiate into the floor and the walls. Coals are slow, and slow is what keeps you alive when you have half a cord and 40 days of winter. She rearranged the remaining fire into a low mound, pressing the pieces close together so they glowed without flaming. The light dropped. The heat did not. Ragna held her hand 6 inches above the coals and felt the warmth, steady even, pushing outward rather than upward. This is how my mother's people heated a house for 20 people through winters that killed settlers in their boxes, Josephine said. Not with bigger fires, with better ones. Progress came in increments that Ragna marked on the inside of the entrance wall with the auger tip, scratching a line for each day. Day 13, January 10th. Smoke hole open to the width of a dinner plate with windscreen positioned. Draft tested. Blue and climbing in north wind, stable in west wind, slight rollback in south wind that required adjustment. Day 15, January 12th. Entrance passage narrowed with 28 sod blocks. Crosswind eliminated. Temperature inside the lodge measured by ice skin testing on water in cups placed at 3 positions. Approximately 42 degrees at the entrance, 48 degrees at the center, 52 degrees at the sleeping bench. Day 17, January 14th. 2 roof props set under weakened beams. Josephine and Ragna tested both by hanging Ragna's weight from the rafters. Not a precise engineering measurement, but a test that made both of them certain the props could hold more than one body's weight against the downward press of frozen earth. Day 19, January 16th. Half-cord wood restacked on willow poles to keep it off the ground. Dry niches identified along the rear wall where airflow kept moisture low. Fuel estimated to last 25 to 30 days at coal fire rate, 12 to 15 at flame fire rate. Day 21, January 18th. Slough grass mattress braided and laid on the sleeping bench. Bench surface raised 4 inches above the floor on flat stones. Josephine's instruction, because cold air pooled at the lowest point in 4 inches of elevation, meant the difference between waking stiff and waking numb. Day 23, Tso, January 20th. Snowmelt barrels set beneath a steady drip from the entrance passage roof, where the heat differential between inside and outside created a reliable melt line. Water supply no longer required gathering snow and warming it by hand. Physical toll accumulated alongside the progress marks. Ragna's hands were split across every knuckle. The skin cracked deep enough that the flesh beneath was visible, raw red lines that bled when she gripped the hoe or the auger and stiffened into crusts when she slept. She had lost weight. Her coat hung looser at the waist, and the wool blanket, wrapped around her at night, no longer pulled tight across her shoulders. Her cough had not worsened, but it had not improved. The lodge air was drier than outside, which helped, but the occasional smoke reversal in shifting winds sent her into spasms that left her ribs aching and her vision spotted. Tippet slept near the entrance and growled before visitors arrived. The dog had become a perimeter, not a guard, but an alarm that gave Ragna 30 seconds to prepare before a face appeared in the tunnel. Lavina came twice more. The first time she brought a scrap of salt pork wrapped in newspaper and stood in the center of the lodge for 10 minutes, looking at the improvements without comment. The second time she brought her son, a boy of 12 named Oren, not the Oren who would matter later, a different boy with the same plain name common to the settlements. The boy carried a bundle of cattail fluff that Lavina said was useless for anything except stuffing, and Ragna packed it into the sleeping mattress until the mattress held warmth like a living thing. Asa Whitcomb visited on January 22nd. He had been hauling freight to the settlements and heard about Ragna's improvements from Lavina's neighbor. He arrived on foot, snow to his shins, and stood inside the lodge for 5 minutes without speaking. He measured the chamber with boot steps, 11 paces from wall to wall. He touched the packed earth. He examined the props, the sod block entrance, the coal bed, the vent screen. Then he said, "A dugout is one thing. An old lodge with a tired roof is another. I have seen sod roofs fail in March when the weight of melt saturates earth that held all winter. This roof is older than any soddy I know." "It has held this long," Ragna said. "It has held without a person inside keeping fire," Isa said. "Fire changes the moisture. Warm air rises, meets cold earth, and condenses. Condensation weakens the bond between the earth layers and the frame. If you keep this fire burning for 60 days, the roof will be weaker on day 60 than it was on day 1. Ragna looked at Josephine, who was sitting near the rear wall mending a tear in her coat. Josephine did not look up. "The fire stays small," Ragna said. "The coals sit low. The smoke goes up, not into the earth." Asa was not convinced. He pulled a candle stub from his coat pocket and set it on the floor near the sleeping bench. "Light this. Block the entrance with your blanket. If the flame burns clean for 1 hour with no draft from outside, the air inside is moving well enough to keep you alive through a sealed storm. If the flame gutters or the smoke goes sideways, you have a problem you have not solved." It was a test, a fair one. Ragna lit the candle. Asa blocked the entrance with the blanket, pressing it against the sod blocks until no light showed around the edges. Then he sat beside Josephine and waited. The flame burned, straight, steady. The thin line of smoke from the wick rose toward the smoke hole and disappeared. The coal bed in the fire pit glowed. The air moved, slowly, imperceptibly, but it moved, drawn upward through the vent by the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cold sky above. The lodge was breathing through a hole the width of a dinner plate, and it was enough. After 1 hour and 17 minutes, Asa counted, watching the candle's slow consumption. The flame was still clean. No gutter, no sideways drift. The air inside the lodge was alive. Asa pulled the blanket down and stood. He looked at the candle, then at the walls, then at Ragna. "This proves ordinary cold," he said, "not blizzard pressure. A blizzard drives snow into gaps you cannot see and seals vents you think are open. What works in January, calm, may not work in January, rage." He left. At the entrance, he paused and set something on the ground, a bent stovepipe elbow, rusted at the seam but intact. He did not say why. He did not offer it as a gift. He set it down the way a man sets down a tool he no longer needs and walks away. Josephine picked it up that evening. She turned it in her hands, studying the angle, the diameter, the way the crimped edges locked together. Then she looked at Ragna and said, "This is a collar. If you mount it inside the smoke hole, the elbow breaks the downdraft without closing the opening. Wind hits the bend and deflects. Smoke finds the gap around the edge." They mounted it that night. Josephine held the elbow in place while Ragna packed sod and frozen grass around the base to anchor it. The fit was crude. The elbow was too small for the hole, and the gap around the edges was uneven. But when the wind shifted north at midnight and the draft that had been rolling smoke back into the chamber hit the elbow instead, the smoke deflected and rose clean. The lodge had a collar. The lodge had props. The lodge had a narrowed entrance, a clear drainage groove, a coal fire, a windscreen, a sleeping bench raised above the cold floor, a water supply, and a woman who had learned enough to understand how much she still did not know. But it had not been tested. Not truly, and the test was coming. January 12th dawned mild. That was the word the settlers used afterward when they reconstructed the sequence of the day and tried to understand how something so ordinary had preceded something so lethal. Mild. The temperature at sunrise was above freezing, 34 degrees, perhaps 36. Snow softened on south-facing slopes. Water dripped from eaves. Children walked to the schoolhouse without heavy coats. Men stood outside the general store and said that winter had broken, that the worst was past, that the January thaw had arrived early and strong. Ragna felt the mildness. She crawled out of the lodge entrance into air that did not cut. Tippet came out behind her, squinted at the brightness, and then did something the dog had not done in 12 days. It refused food. Ragna held out a piece of dried grass root she had been chewing for breakfast, and Tippet turned its head away. Then the dog pawed at the entrance passage. Not to go in, but to widen it, the way an animal prepares a den for occupancy it does not yet need. Ragna watched the dog. She remembered her father. Animals do not walk toward death when they can smell warmth. But the corollary was also true. Animals do not dig toward shelter when they can smell safety. Tippet could smell something coming. Ragna could not. But she trusted the dog the way she had trusted it on the night it led her to the lodge, and she went back inside and spent the morning cutting extra sod blocks and stacking them near the entrance. Josephine arrived at noon. She had been walking from her quarters near Columbus and had covered the last 4 miles in weather that felt like early April. She entered the lodge, looked at the stacked sod blocks, looked at Tippet lying rigid near the entrance with its ears flat, and said, "When is the last time you saw the dog eat?" "This morning." It would not. Josephine went outside. She stood on the rise above the smoke hole and looked northwest. The sky in that direction was not cloudy. It was a color Ragna had never seen, a yellowish white, flat and featureless, like a wall made of old linen. The air was still. No wind. The willows hung motionless. "Get inside," Josephine said. "Now, both shovels." Ragna had 2 shovels, the broken hoe she used for cutting, and a flat-bladed spade Lavina's son had brought the week before. She put one inside the lodge and one outside the entrance, wedged under a sod block where snow could not bury it. Josephine's instruction from the week before. Always 1 shovel on each side, so the entrance could be cleared from either direction. Josephine did not stay. She said she had to reach the road before whatever was coming arrived. Rana asked her to stay. Josephine shook her head. "You know enough," Josephine said. She put her hand on Rana's shoulder, the first time she had touched her since they met. "Keep the smoke holes smaller than fear wants. Keep the shovels where they are. And if the storm turns so bad that people come to you, let them in. All of them. Even the ones who laughed." She walked east into the yellow-white sky and disappeared before Ragna could say goodbye. The blizzard arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon of January 12th, 1888. It did not build. It struck. 1 minute the air was still and mild, the temperature hovering near 35 degrees. The next minute a wall of wind hit the willows with a sound like a freight car coupling, and the temperature fell so fast that the moisture in the air froze into a powder finer than flour. Visibility dropped from 1/2 mile to 10 feet in the time it took Ragna to turn from the entrance and look at the sky. She could not see the sky. There was no sky. There was wind and white, and a sound that was not a howl but a roar. Continuous, without pause, without rhythm, the sound of air moving at 50 miles an hour across a flat landscape with nothing to stop it. Inside the lodge, the first sign was the silence. The roof stopped dripping. The meltwater that had been seeping through the entrance passage froze mid-drip, leaving a ridge of ice across the floor. Then Tippet began howling, not barking, howling, into the entrance passage. a sound Ragana had never heard the dog make, a sound that went on and on until she pulled the dog inside and blocked the entrance with her blanket and the last sod blocks she had stacked. The temperature inside the lodge, which had been 54 degrees that morning, began to drop. Not fast. The earth walls did their work, refusing to surrender warmth quickly, but steadily. 52. 50. The coal bed in the fire pit glowed, and Ragna fed it carefully, one piece of dry willow at a time, coals not flames, the way Josephine had taught her. The smoke hole. She looked up. The stovepipe collar was still in place, but snow was building around its edges, pushed by wind that screamed across the opening like a hand drawn over a bottle. The smoke rose, hit the accumulating snow crust, and began to curl, not rolling back yet, but threatening. She had to keep the collar clear. She had to keep the fire low. She had to keep the entrance sealed. She had to do all three at once, alone, with one pair of cracked hands and a cough that was already tightening in her chest from the first wisps of misdirected smoke. The entrance passage rattled, not wind, a human sound, pounding. Someone was pounding on the sod blocks from outside. Ragna pulled 2 blocks free, and a face appeared in the gap, crusted with ice, eyes swollen nearly shut, hair frozen into ropes. Lavina Roach. Behind her, nothing but white. "Nora," Lavina said. The word came out broken, half frozen, the consonants blurred by lips that could barely move. "Nora left the school. She's on the creek fence. She's out there." Nora, 8 years old, Lavina's youngest, sent home from the schoolhouse early because the teacher had looked at the mild sky and decided the children could leave before the regular hour. Ragna pulled Lavina inside. The woman collapsed on the floor near the fire pit, shaking so hard her teeth cracked against each other with a sound like gravel. Ice fell from her coat and melted instantly on the warm, packed earth. "How long?" Ragna asked. "I do not know. An hour. Maybe more. She follows the fence wire between the school and the house. She always follows the fence." Ragna looked at the entrance, sealed with sod blocks. She looked at the fire, burning low and steady. She looked at Lavina, who could not stand. She looked at Tippett, who was already at the entrance, nose pressed to the gap where the blocks did not quite meet. Josephine's voice came to her. "If the storm turns so bad that people come to you, let them in." But Josephine had not said, "Go out." Ragna gave Lavina the smoke instructions. Blue and climbing means safe. Brown and rolling means the vent is clogged. If it rolls, use the willow pole to push the snow off the collar. Do not let the fire flame. Do not open the entrance wider than 1 block. If Ragana did not return, Lavina was to keep the fire and keep herself alive and tell Asa Whitcomb what happened. Lavina grabbed Ragna's wrist. "You cannot see out there. You cannot stand in that wind." "Tippett can smell," Ragna said. She tied Lavina's rope, a length of braided rawhide Lavina had carried from her house, to the base of the nearest center post. She tied the other end around her waist. 30 feet of rope. Not enough. Not nearly enough to reach the creek fence where Nora had been walking, but enough to get outside and orient herself and begin. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. She pulled 1 sod block free and crawled into the passage. The sound hit her first, a pressure against her eardrums that was not just noise but force, the wind compressing the air in the tunnel until it felt like being inside a bellows. Then the cold. Not the cold she had been living with for 2 weeks, the manageable cold of a well-insulated lodge in ordinary winter. This was a different thing entirely. This was cold as violence. The air outside the passage was -15 degrees and falling, driven by a wind that made the effective temperature something she could not calculate and did not want to. The snow was not falling. It was moving horizontally, driven so hard that it hit her face like sand and pushed under her eyelids and into her nostrils. She could not see. Not reduced visibility. No visibility. She held her hand in front of her face and could not see her fingers. The world was white and screaming, and she was on her hands and knees in it with a rope around her waist, and a dog beside her. Tippet pressed ahead. The dog's nose was down, cutting through the snow, moving not by sight but by scent. What it was smelling, a child's trail, body warmth, the faint signature of a living thing in a landscape that was trying to kill everything warm, Ragna did not know. She followed the dog because the dog was moving, and she could not navigate any other way. The rope paid out behind her. 10 feet, 20, 25. She was almost at the limit. The willows thrashed invisibly around her, and a branch whipped across her cheek and drew blood she could not feel because her face was already numb. At 28 feet, Tippet stopped. The dog sniffed the ground, circled, and barked. Ragna's hands found something hard and flat in the snow. A school slate, cracked down the middle, still tied with a leather strap. Nora's slate, the fence wire. Nora followed the fence. Ragna reached up and found it. A single strand of wire strung between posts along the creek bluff, the posts spaced 10 feet apart. The wire was coated in ice and hummed under her mittens like a living string. She followed it, one hand on the wire, the other holding the rope. She counted posts. 1, 2, 3. At the fourth post, the rope snapped taut. 30 feet. She was at the end. She could not go farther without cutting the rope. If she cut the rope, she had no way back to the lodge. The passage was invisible. The willows were invisible. In this wind, at this temperature, without a guideline, she could walk 50 feet and miss the entrance by 6 inches and die within shouting distance of warmth. Tippet was still moving. The dog had gone past the rope's limit, following the fence wire by touch and smell. Ragna could hear the dog barking, faintly, somewhere ahead, the sound torn apart by wind. She cut the rope. The knife went through the braided rawhide in one stroke. The loose end whipped away behind her and vanished. She was untethered, connected to nothing except the fence wire under her left hand and the sound of the dog ahead. She followed the wire. 5th post, 6th. Her feet were no longer cold. They were absent, wooden blocks at the ends of her legs that she moved by memory rather than sensation. Her hands on the wire left skin behind. She could feel the mittens tearing on the ice-coated metal. Her cough hit, doubled her over, and the wind shoved her sideways off the wire. She grabbed for it blindly, caught it, held on, and kept moving. At the 9th post, Tippet barked directly below her. Ragna dropped to her knees. Her hands found fur, the dog's back. Then, beneath the dog, a shape. Small. Curled. Not moving. Nora Roach, 8 years old, curled in a buffalo grass hollow beside the fence post, knees drawn to her chest, face turned away from the wind. Her coat was iced solid. Her hair was frozen to the grass. But when Ragna put her hand against the child's neck, she felt a pulse. Faint, slow, but present. Ragna pulled the child onto her back. Nora weighed perhaps 50 pounds, but in the wind, carrying her was like carrying a dead weight uphill. Ragna could not see. She could not follow the fence wire because both hands were holding the child. She had no rope. She had no guide. She had the dog. Tippet moved ahead, then circled back, then moved ahead again, the same pattern the dog had used on the night it led Ragna to the lodge. "Follow me. This way." Ragna followed. Step by step, blind, the wind slamming her sideways with every gust, the child's weight pulling her off balance, her feet striking objects she could not identify. A root, a buried stump, the edge of the creek bank where one wrong step would send her down the frozen slope. The willows appeared as sensations, not shapes. Branches whipping her arms, scrub catching her skirt. She was close. She could feel the change in wind as the thicket broke the worst of the horizontal blast. Then the snow slope, the entrance. But the passage was half sealed. Snow had drifted against the opening in the 20 minutes since she left, packing the gap between the sod blocks with a dense white plug. From inside she heard pounding. Metal on frozen earth. Lavina digging from the inside with the spade, the shovel Ragna had kept inside, the second shovel, Josephine's rule, one inside and one outside, always. The outside shovel was buried. Ragna kicked at the snow plug with boots she could not feel. Tippet dug beside her, claws raking the packed drift. From inside, the spade broke through. A burst of warm air and dim firelight, and Lavina's hand reaching through the gap. Ragna pushed Nora through first, then Tippet, then herself. Inside, the lodge was 50 degrees. The coal bed glowed steady. The smoke rose blue through the collar. Lavina had followed every instruction. Ragna stripped Nora's frozen stockings and boots. The child's feet were white, not blue, not black, but the waxy white of tissue that has been cold long enough to stop circulation, but not long enough to die. She warmed stones near the coals and placed them against the child's feet, wrapped in the slough grass mattress. She wrapped Nora in the wool blanket and laid her on the sleeping bench 4 inches above the cold floor. Nora breathed, slowly, but she breathed. Lavina knelt beside her daughter and pressed her face against the child's chest and made a sound that was not crying and not speaking, but something older than both. The sound of a mother hearing a heartbeat she had been preparing to never hear again. The storm did not care about the reunion. Outside, the wind built past 60 miles an hour. The temperature dropped past -20. Snow buried the entrance passage completely, and only the stovepipe collar, angled against the downdraft, kept the smoke hole functional. The entrance pounded again. Asa Whitcomb crawled through the gap Lavina had kept partially clear. He was frost white from the waist up, his hands wrapped in strips of burlap that were frozen stiff. He had tried to walk between 2 houses 300 yards apart and lost direction after 50 steps. He had followed the sound of Tippet's barking to the willow thicket and found the entrance by the warmth rising from the passage. He said nothing when he entered. He sat near the fire and held his hands toward the coals and looked at the walls and the roof and the smoke rising clean and the child sleeping on the raised bench, and he did not speak for a long time. Then the entrance pounded again. Merritt Vale, 2 of his men behind him. His wagon stock had drifted 1/2 mile from camp, and his tent had collapsed under wind-driven snow. He had seen the faint glow of warmth at the lodge entrance, the telltale sign of heated air meeting frozen air, and he had come because he had no other choice. Ragna stood between the entrance and the fire pit. Merritt stood in the passage, ice in his beard, his eyes red from wind and snow, his shoulders hunched against a cold that had reduced him from a man who gave orders to a man who needed permission to enter a hole in the ground. "Let them in," Josephine had said. "All of them, even the ones who laughed." Ragna stepped aside. Merritt entered. His men followed. They sat against the far wall, as far from the fire as the chamber allowed, occupying the least space, the posture of men who understood they were guests in a house they had mocked. 9 people and a dog in a 32-foot circle of packed earth. The coal fire burned low and steady. The smoke rose blue. The temperature held at 51 degrees, while outside the world disappeared into white violence and the effective temperature dropped below -40. The smoke rolled back twice during the night. The first time, Ragna cleared the collar with the willow pole while Lavina held a wet cloth over Nora's face. The second time, the snow was packed too hard for the pole. Ragna told Merritt to climb the interior ladder, a series of notched logs against the rear wall, remnants of the original construction, and hold the vent screen in place while she punched through from below. Merritt refused. "Do it, or the child dies of smoke," Ragna said, "and everyone in this room will know why." Merritt climbed the ladder. He held the screen against the downdraft with both hands, while the wind screamed through the gap around his fingers and the cold burned his skin. He held it for 20 minutes. When he came down, his hands were blistered red across the palms. He sat against the wall and wrapped them in his coat and said nothing. At some point during the night, she could not tell when because time had lost its structure in the storm, Ragna noticed Nora's breathing had changed. Faster, shallower. A wet sound in the exhale that made Lavina sit up straight. The child coughed, and the cough brought flecks of pink. Not blood, not yet, but the color of tissue stressed beyond its ordinary work. Ragna warmed more stones, packed them around the child's torso, elevated Nora's head with the cattail fluff mattress folded double. Tippet lay across the child's legs, adding the dog's body heat to the stones and the blanket and the steady 51 degrees the lodge held against the howling dark. Asa watched. He had not moved from the fire pit. His burlap-wrapped hands were thawing, and the thawing hurt. She could see it in his face, the particular grimace of nerve endings coming back to life. But he watched Ragna work, and at some point in the deep hours of the night, he leaned forward and touched the packed wall beside him. He held his hand there for a long moment. "This is not luck," Asa said. Outside, the bachelor-settler Milo Hosker, 3 miles east, fed his hay-burning stove until the straw caught the chimney pipe and the fire spread to the sod walls. He died in the smoke before the flames reached him. They found him in the morning, curled beside the stove, his hands still reaching for the damper he could not close. Inside the lodge, 9 people breathed, and the coals held, and the earth held, and the roof held, and the blue smoke climbed through the collar into the storm. Dawn came without sunrise. The wind slowed from a roar to a moan, then to a hiss, then to something that was almost silence. Ragna crawled through the entrance passage, now a tunnel of compacted snow she had to chisel open, and stood on the surface. The world was unrecognizable. Drifts taller than a person buried the willow thickets. The creek bluff was a white slope with no features. The wagon road, the fence post, the claim marker, all gone. The lodge entrance was a dark gap in a snowfield, visible from 10 feet away and invisible from 20. Nora was alive. Her feet had color. Her breathing had steadied in the hours before dawn, the wet sound fading as the warmth did its slow work. Lavina carried her daughter out into the gray morning light, and the child opened her eyes and asked where the dog was. Asa Whitcomb came out after Lavina. He stood in the snow, with his blistered hands hanging at his sides, and looked at the lodge entrance, then at the sky, then at the unmarked snowfield where Milo Hasker's sod house was burning down to its foundations 3 miles away. He did not say the lodge had saved them. He did not need to. The math was visible. Everyone who had been inside the lodge was alive. Milo, in his sod house with his hay stove, was dead. The difference was not effort. It was design. It was earth that held warmth instead of walls that gave it away. It was a structure built by people who had lived on this prairie for generations and understood what the winters demanded, and a woman who had been desperate enough to listen to a stray dog and stubborn enough to learn from a stranger. Merritt Vale came out last. He looked at Ragna. She looked at him. Neither spoke. He walked east through the drifts with his 2 men behind him, their footprints filling with blown snow before they reached the edge of the willows. The storm was over. The test had come, and the lodge had held. But survival, Ragna was beginning to understand, was not the end of the story. It was the point where the story changed direction. Chunk 3 continues. The morning after the blizzard remade Cedar Draw, not in the way storms usually remade settlements, broken fences, dead stock, drifted roads that would take days to clear. Those things happen, but the deeper change was in the arithmetic people carried in their heads, the quiet calculations that governed who they trusted and what they believed about shelter, survival, and the woman they had called a badger. Nora Roach lived. Her feet kept their color. By the 3rd day after the storm, she was walking, unsteadily, holding Lavina's hand, and asking when she could see the dog again. The question traveled through the settlement faster than any news about the blizzard's damage, because a living child is a more powerful argument than any number of frozen cattle or collapsed sod walls. Milo Hasker was dead. They found him on January 14th, 2 days after the storm broke, when a neighbor broke through the drifts to check on him. The sod house had burned to its foundation line. The hay stove, overfed in panic, had caught the chimney pipe, and the fire had spread through the grass-stuffed walls with a speed that sod was supposed to prevent, but did not when the grass was dry and the wind drove flame through every seam. Milo had not burned. He had suffocated in the smoke before the fire reached him. He was 31. He had filed his claim 8 months earlier and had told the storekeeper's wife he planned to send for his brother in the spring. The contrast sat in people's minds like a stone in a boot. Milo, in a proper sod house with a proper stove, was dead. Ragna, in a hole in the ground with a coal fire and a dog, was alive. 9 people had sheltered in the lodge during the worst blizzard in living memory, and all 9 had walked out in the morning. The earth had held, the smoke had risen. The temperature inside had stayed above 50 degrees, while outside it dropped below -40 with wind. Asa Whitcomb was the first to speak about it publicly, and the place he chose was the general store, because the general store was where opinion formed in Cedar Draw the way weather formed on the horizon, visibly, slowly, and with consequences. He stood near the counter with his hand still wrapped in linen from the frostbite that had taken the feeling from 2 fingers on his left hand. The storekeeper, 3 farmers, Lavina's neighbor, and the churchwoman who had accepted Ragna's sewing but refused her a bed were all present. Merritt Vale was not. He had gone east with his men and had not been seen since the storm. Asa did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He said what he had to say in the same flat voice he used to describe freight loads and road conditions. I told the Breaky woman she had none of what a person needed to survive on this flat, Asa said. I told her she needed 4 walls, 6 cords, a stove, and a neighbor. I counted wrong. He paused. I counted boards and cords. I did not count earth. The storekeeper asked what he meant. Asa described the lodge, not as a curiosity, not as a Pawnee artifact, but as an engineering fact. 32 feet across, 4 center posts, 2 feet of packed earth over layered willow and grass, a protected entrance that broke the wind, a smoke hole with a collar that deflected downdraft, a floor that sloped toward a drainage channel, a coal fire that heated the earth, an earth that returned the heat slowly, steadily, even when the fire burned low. The walls of that lodge held 51 degrees while Milo Hasker's sod house burned around him, Asa said. I sat inside with my hands thawing, and I touched the wall, and it was warm. Not hot. Warm. The way a stone is warm after the sun goes down. The earth had been holding heat for weeks, and it gave it back when we needed it. The churchwoman asked if the lodge was safe. Asa said it had passed a candle test for 1 hour and 17 minutes, and it had held 9 people and a dog through a blizzard that killed between 200 and 300 people across Nebraska and Dakota Territory. Then he said, I am not telling anyone to live in a hole. I am telling you that the woman I said had nothing built something that worked better than anything I have seen in 30 years of hauling freight across this country. And she did not build it alone. The people who built it first knew more about surviving here than we do. He bought a pound of coffee and left. The effect was not immediate. Opinions in small communities turn like heavy wheels, slowly, with friction, and sometimes backward before they go forward. But the wheel had been pushed, and the direction was set. Lavina Roach came to the lodge 3 days after the storm. She did not come for charity. She did not come to see the shelter. She came with a specific question. How did the drainage work? Her own sod house had survived the blizzard, but the melt afterward had pooled against the foundation, and the southwest wall was soft where water had saturated the base. She had been scooping mud for 2 days. She wanted to know how the lodge managed water, because the lodge floor had been dry when she crawled in half-frozen with Nora missing, and it had been dry when she crawled out in the morning. Ragna showed her. The groove in the floor, running from the sleeping bench toward the entrance. The slight slope, so slight it was invisible to the eye but measurable with a cup of water. The clear path through the entrance passage where water could flow out rather than pool against the walls. This is not complicated, Ragna said. It is a ditch. It is a ditch in the right place, Lavina said. Mine is in the wrong place because I dug my foundation level and the water has nowhere to go. Ragna went to Lavina's soddy that afternoon. She stood in the mud at the base of the southwest wall and looked at the way the ground sloped, toward the house, not away from it. Every melt, every rain, every thaw would send water against this wall. The sod blocks at the base were already swelling, the grass roots losing their grip in the saturated soil. You need a trench, Ragna said. Not inside, outside. 6 inches deep, angled away from the wall toward the creek. The water follows the trench instead of the wall. 6 inches, Lavina repeated. That is all? That is all. But it has to be angled correctly, or the water pools in the trench and makes a new problem. They dug the trench together. It took 2 hours. When they finished, Ragna poured a cup of water at the base of the wall and watched it flow down the trench and away from the foundation. The wall would dry. The sod blocks would tighten. The house would hold. Lavina stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the trench and said, I have lived in this house for 4 years, and I never thought to put a ditch beside it. The people who built the lodge did not have to think about it, Ragna said. They knew. Other settlers came, not many at first, and not eagerly. A farmer named Holst, whose root cellar had flooded during the thaw. A widow named Marte Solheim, whose chimney draft reversed in high wind. A young couple who had filed a claim in November and built a sod house so thin-walled that the interior temperature matched the exterior within 2 hours of the fire going out. Ragna answered their questions. She did not charge. She did not claim expertise. She said plainly that she had learned from a woman named Josephine Baptiste, and that Josephine had learned from her mother, and that her mother had learned from a tradition of building that predated every claim office and every settler on the plains. She said the lodge was not hers, and the knowledge was not hers. She was passing along what she had been given. Some settlers accepted this framing. Others did not. The storekeeper's wife said it was one thing to survive a night in an Indian cave, and another to tell good Christian families how to build. The churchwoman said Ragna should be grateful anyone listened to her at all, given her circumstances. A man Ragna had never met rode out to the lodge, looked at it from horseback, and said, I would not put a hog in that. But Nora Roach was alive, and Milo Hasker was dead, and the arithmetic was louder than the opinions. Merritt Vale returned to the settlement in late January. He had been east, arranging new wagon stock and repairing his reputation after the blizzard destroyed his team. He came back quieter than before. Not chastened, not converted, but recalibrated. He had been inside the lodge during the storm. He had held the vent screen while his hands blistered. He had been saved by the structure he mocked, and the saving had not softened him. It had sharpened his resentment. His first move was not direct. He did not confront Ragna. He went to the county clerk's office in the nearest town and asked about the legal status of the lodge site. The clerk told him what Merritt already suspected. The land had not been claimed under the Homestead Act, and the lodge was not a recognized dwelling under territorial law. It was, legally, an abandoned structure on unclaimed ground. Anyone who filed on the quarter section that contained it could claim the site, the timber, and the materials. Merritt did not file. Filing cost $14 and required residency improvements he was not prepared to make. But he began telling people, stoppers at the store, at the livery, in the barn talk that passed for public discourse, that Ragna was squatting on a place no court would defend, that the old timber inside had value, and that the foreign girl was using the settlement's sympathy to build a position she had no legal right to hold. The accusation had teeth because it was partially true. Ragna had no claim. She had no legal standing. The lodge was not hers, and she had never said it was. But Merritt framed her honesty as vulnerability, and vulnerability as opportunity. Ragna heard about Merritt's campaign from Lavina, who heard it from the storekeeper, who heard it from Merritt himself. The news landed like a stone in her stomach. She had survived the blizzard, saved a child, taught 3 families how to drain their foundations, and now the man who had abandoned her in the snow was working to take the shelter that had kept her alive. She could not fight him legally. She had $3.80 and no understanding of territorial land law. She could not fight him physically. She could not fight him politically. She was an unmarried immigrant woman with no family, no property, and no standing. She could only keep working. And that is what she did. Josephine returned in the second week of February. She had been east of Columbus, tending a cousin who had taken ill after the blizzard. The cousin had survived, but the journey had cost Josephine. She was thinner than when she left. Her cough, she had one too, a deep one that Ragna recognized, was worse. She walked into the lodge without announcing herself, sat beside the fire, and looked at the improvements Ragna had made in her absence. The entrance was tighter. The drainage groove was deeper. A second windscreen had been added to the smoke hole, angled against the secondary wind direction that Ragna had mapped during the storm. The sleeping bench had been rebuilt with flat stones and packed earth, raised 6 inches now instead of 4. The interior was not luxurious. It was functional, deliberate, and warm. Josephine said, "You learned." "You taught me," Ragna said. "I taught you the beginning. You are building the middle." Josephine held her hands over the coals. Her fingers were swollen at the joints, rheumatism that the cold worsened and the warmth only partially eased. "Tell me about the storm," Ragna told her. The arrival, the wall of wind, Lavina's appearance, the decision to go out for Nora, the rope, the dog, the fence wire, cutting the line, finding the child, the sealed entrance, Lavina digging from inside with the shovel, Merritt arriving, the smoke rollback, Merritt holding the vent screen. Josephine listened without interrupting. When Ragna finished, Josephine said, "You let him in. You told me to." "I told you to let them all in. I did not tell you to let him hold the screen. That was yours." Ragna did not understand the distinction and said so. "Letting him in saved his body," Josephine said. "Making him hold the screen saved his pride. A man who is carried does not change. A man who is made to work changes, even if he hates the work. You gave him something to do besides sit and be rescued. That matters." Ragna thought about this. She was not sure Josephine was right. Merritt had come out of the lodge and walked away without speaking, and now he was working to take the sight from her. That did not look like a man who had changed. "He is not finished yet," Josephine said, as if reading the thought. "Neither are you." The weeks that followed were the deepest period of collaboration between the two women. Josephine moved into the lodge, not permanently, but for stretches of days at a time when the weather was bad or her cough was worse than usual. She slept on the opposite side of the fire from Ragna, and Tippett moved between them, drawn to whichever body was warmest. They built together. A sod block vestibule at the entrance, a small antechamber that created a second airlock so that opening the outer passage did not send a direct draft into the main chamber. The blocks were 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, 3 feet long, standard settler dimensions that Ragna could cut in her sleep now, her hands scarred but no longer splitting, the muscles in her forearms knotted from weeks of hauling. They improved the vent system. Josephine showed Ragna how to weave a willow lattice, tight enough to catch snow but open enough to pass smoke, and mounted inside the collar as a secondary screen. The lattice could be pulled out and cleaned, replacing the laborious process of punching through ice with the willow pole. They whitewashed the clay around the hearth with a mixture of chalk and water that Josephine made from deposits along the creek bank. The whitewash served 2 purposes. It reflected firelight back into the chamber, doubling the illumination from the coal bed, and it showed smoke stains. Clean whitewash meant clean air. Darkened whitewash meant the draft was failing, even if the smoke was not yet visible to the eye. They talked while they worked. Josephine's story came in pieces, offered without sequence or sentiment, the way a person shares a life that has been broken and reassembled too many times for chronological telling. Her mother had been born in a lodge on the Loo River, not this lodge, another farther north, in the village the government had recognized before the removal. Her father, the French trader, had married her mother in a ceremony that no church recorded and no court recognized. When the Pawnee were removed to Indian Territory in the 1870s, Josephine's mother went south. Josephine stayed. She was 18, already working as a seamstress and interpreter near the agency, already fluent in English and French and Pawnee, already too useful to be forced out and too native to be welcomed. She had lived between worlds ever since. She sewed for settler women who would not eat at her table. She interpreted for agency men who forgot her name between visits. She watched the empty villages along the Loo fill with grass and settle into the earth, the lodges collapsing one by one as the timber rotted and the prairie reclaimed what the builders had been made to leave. Settlers called them pits, Josephine said. Free material. They pulled the posts for firewood and the willow for fencing, They did not know what they were destroying because they did not care to ask. Ragna listened. She did not say she was sorry, because sorry was a word settlers used when they meant nothing, and Josephine would know the difference. She said, "This lodge is still standing because no one found it." "This lodge is still standing because the brush grew over it and the entrance silted shut," Josephine said. "It was not hidden on purpose. It was forgotten. Forgetting is not the same as protecting." The distinction mattered. Ragna felt it settle into her understanding of what she was doing in this place. She was not preserving the lodge. She was using it. The difference between those two things was the difference between respect and appropriation, and the line was thinner than she had imagined. "I want to use this place to teach people," Ragna said. "The drainage, the earth mass, the fire discipline, the things you taught me. People are asking." Josephine was quiet for a long time. The coals popped. Tippett sighed in his sleep. "Permission is not mine alone to give," Josephine said. "My mother's people are in Indian territory. The ones who remember this country are old or dead. I cannot speak for them." She paused. "But respect is your responsibility to practice. If you teach, you say where the knowledge came from. You do not say you invented it. You do not say you discovered it. You say you were taught, and you were taught by a tradition that was here before any of us, and that tradition deserves to be honored even when the people who carried it were driven away." "I will," Ragna said, "then teach." The disagreement came in March. A family named Holst, the farmer whose root cellar had flooded, asked Rana to help them build a small storm refuge attached to their sod house. An earth-sheltered room, 8 feet by 10, with a 4-foot berm on 3 sides, a covered entrance facing away from the prevailing wind, a vent hole with a collar, and a drainage trench. Not a lodge. A refuge. A place to go when the wind turned killing. Ragna agreed. She drew the plan on a piece of brown paper using measurements she had worked out from the lodge's proportions, scaled down for a single-family shelter. She showed the drawing to Josephine. Josephine looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "No." Ragna waited. "You are building a lodge," Josephine said. "A small one, but a lodge. Earth over a frame, entrance passage, central vent. This is not a root cellar with improvements. This is a copy." "It is a refuge," Ragna said. "It will save lives in storms." "It will save lives. And it will look like something my mother's people built, and settlers will call it clever, and they will never say where it came from." The argument was not loud. It was quiet, deliberate, and uncomfortable. The kind of argument between two people who respected each other enough to say what they meant and trusted each other enough to risk the damage. Ragna said she could not change the physics. Earth over a frame, with a protected entrance and controlled ventilation, was the design that worked. She could not make it work differently just to make it look different. Josephine said the physics were not the problem. The problem was the story that would be told about the physics. A settler woman builds storm shelters that save lives. That is the story the settlement would tell. The part about the Pawnee woman who taught her, the Pawnee mothers who invented the design, the Pawnee nation that was removed so settlers could farm the land the lodges had stood on, that part would vanish. The way it always vanished. The way her mother's village had vanished into grass and pits and free material. Ragna said, "Then help me tell the story correctly." Josephine said, "I have been telling it correctly for 30 years. No one listened." They did not speak for 2 days. Josephine stayed in the lodge but slept on the far side and worked alone, mending her coat, scraping hides she had brought from Columbus, moving through the space as if Ragna were not there. On the 3rd day, Ragna brought the brown paper drawing to Josephine and said, "Write on it. Your name, your mother's name, the word Pawnee, whatever you want written. It goes on the first page of every drawing I make. No one builds from my plans without seeing it." Josephine looked at the paper. She took the pencil Ragna offered and wrote, in a hand that was precise and practiced, the hand of a woman who had served as an interpreter and knew the weight of written words. Taught by Josephine Baptiste, daughter of a Pawnee mother. Earth Lodge design belongs to the Pawnee people. She handed the paper back. This will not change anything, she said. It will change the paper, Ragna said. Josephine almost smiled. Almost. The expression came and went like light through a crack. But the silence between them ended, and they ate together that evening, and the argument had done what good arguments do. It had made both of them more careful without making either of them smaller. Spring came hard and fast. The snow melted in weeks rather than months, driven by warm Chinook winds that rolled down from the northwest and turned the frozen prairie into a landscape of running water. The creek rose. The lowland flooded. Water that had been locked in ice since November found its way downhill with the blind, relentless logic of gravity. Two of the storm refugees Ragna had helped families begin, the Holst shelter and a smaller one for the young couple who had filed in November, were threatened. The Holst shelter had been dug into a south-facing slope, which was correct for wind protection, but wrong for spring runoff. Water sheeted across the slope and pooled against the earth berm on the uphill side. The berm, freshly built and not yet compacted by a full season, began to soften. Ragna saw the problem on a Tuesday morning when she walked out to check on the Holst site. The berm was dark with moisture for 2 feet above the ground line. The earth was not yet flowing, but it was moving, a slow, heavy sag that would become a collapse if the water was not diverted within days. She thought of Josephine's lesson. Meltwater kills earth houses from below, not from above, where the rain hits and runs off. From below, where the water soaks in and saturates the base and turns the foundation into something that cannot hold its own weight. Josephine was not there. Josephine was in the lodge, too sick to walk the 4 miles to the Holst farm. Her cough had worsened through March, and by early April it had become the deep, wet, rattling cough that Ragna recognized from the steerage passage, the sound of lungs filling with fluid they could not clear. Ragna had to solve this alone. She went to the Holst farm and told the farmer to dig, not around the shelter, above it. A diversion trench cut across the slope 20 feet uphill from the berm, angled to carry runoff east toward the creek before it reached the shelter's foundation. Holst resisted. The trench would cut across his planting ground. The water would carve a gully in the slope. He had not built the shelter to create new problems. The shelter is the problem right now, Ragna said. If the berm fails, the water fills the refuge. If the refugee floods, the earth inside turns to mud. If the mud undermines the frame, the roof falls. You will have a hole full of water and broken wood where your family was supposed to shelter. Holst looked at the berm. He could see the darkening. He could see the sag. How deep? He asked. 8 inches. Angled 2 degrees toward the creek. You can measure the angle with a cup of water poured at the head of the trench. If it flows east, the angle is right. They dug. Holst, his wife, Ragna, and Lavina, who had arrived with a shovel and the particular determination of a woman whose daughter's life had been saved by the same principles being applied here. 4 people, 4 shovels, 6 hours. The trench was 60 feet long, 8 inches deep, and angled with a precision that Ragna checked 3 times by pouring water and watching its path. By evening, the runoff was flowing east through the trench instead of south into the berm. The darkening at the berm's base stopped spreading. Within 2 days, the earth began to dry. The shelter held. The young couple's refuge had a different problem. The drainage trench inside the shelter had been dug too shallow, and meltwater seeping through the entrance passage was pooling on the floor instead of flowing out. Ragna crawled inside, deepened the groove by 2 inches, and extended it 6 feet beyond the entrance so that the water had a clear downhill path to open ground. A child stored seed corn, kept in the refuge because the family's sod house had no dry storage, was saved by 4 hours of work. The corn was worth $3. The labor was worth more than the corn, but no one said so, and Ragna did not ask for payment. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. After the flood crisis, 3 families completed their storm refuges by the end of April. The Holst shelter was the largest, 8 by 10 feet, with 4-foot berms on 3 sides, a covered entrance facing southeast, a vent hole with a removable willow collar, and a drainage trench that now connected to the diversion cut above the slope. The young couple's refuge was smaller, 6 by 8 feet, designed as an emergency shelter rather than a habitable space. A third family, the Solheims, built theirs into the side of a low hill behind their barn, using the natural earth cover to reduce the amount of sod they needed to cut and haul. Lavina did not build a refuge. She did something Ragna had not expected. She began teaching, not formally, not with drawings or plans. She taught the way frontier women taught everything, by showing her neighbors what she had seen and explaining why it mattered. She brought women to the lodge and showed them the drainage groove and the vent collar and the whitewashed hearth. She brought Nora, who was 9 now, and had the specific authority of a child who had nearly died. And Nora showed the other children how to read smoke by holding a candle near the vent and watching the flame. "Blue means safe," Nora said, holding the candle steady while 3 children younger than her watched the thin line of smoke rise clean. "Brown means get out." Ragna stood behind the children and watched Nora teach, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a word for. The knowledge was moving. Not because Ragna was pushing it, but because the knowledge itself was useful, and useful things travel the way water travels, downhill, finding the path of least resistance, filling the spaces that need filling. Josephine saw it too. She was sitting near the fire, wrapped in a blanket that Lavina had brought, her cough quiet for the moment. She watched Nora teach the children and said nothing, but her eyes were bright, and her hands, folded in her lap, were still. Josephine grew worse through the summer of 1889. The cough deepened. She lost weight the way a candle loses wax, slowly, visibly, with the flame still burning but the structure diminishing around it. She moved between the lodge and Lavina's spare room, where Lavina had offered a bed without being asked, because Lavina understood that a person who had saved her daughter's life by teaching another woman how to save her daughter's life deserved a bed that did not smell of smoke and earth. In September, Josephine stopped traveling. She stayed in Lavina's spare room and sat by the window and watched the prairie change color. The green fading to gold, the gold fading to brown, the brown deepening toward the gray that meant winter was thinking about returning. Ragna came every day. She sat beside the bed and reported on the shelters. The Holst family had added a second vent. The Solheims had whitewashed their interior. The young couple's drainage was holding through the autumn rains. She reported on Nora's teaching, on the children who now knew what blue smoke meant, on the rope line Asa Whitcomb had strung between his house and his barn after watching Ragna tie one during the blizzard. Josephine listened. She asked questions. She corrected details. The lattice goes inside the collar, not outside, or the ice freezes it to the rim. With the precision of a person who understood that details were not decorations, but load-bearing elements of survival. In late October, on a day when the first real frost turned the grass white and the creek ran so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, Josephine said, "Do not make my mother's house into your miracle. Make it into their lesson." Ragna held Josephine's hand. It was thin, the bones close to the surface, the skin dry and warm. It smelled faintly of smoke and sage. The sage Josephine burned in a small clay dish when her cough was worst, a